The advice Bob Dylan gave the Rolling Stones in 1965 was never meant for the public, never written down, never recorded, and for years Mick Jagger wasn't even sure he wanted to admit it happened at all, because it exposed a truth that would have embarrassed the most dangerous band in the world at the exact moment they were pretending to have it all figured out. December 1965, New York City, the air sharp with cold and ego. The music industry convinced it was in control of the youth it no longer understood. Bob Dylan had already blown the doors off folk music and walked calmly through the wreckage, electric guitar slung over his shoulder like a warning. The Rolling Stones, meanwhile, were conquering America but still felt like trespassers in someone else's house. British blues kids dressed up as rebels, selling danger while quietly wondering how long it would last. That night, after an industry party filled with executives laughing too loud and pretending not to fear the noise their own labels had unleashed, Dylan slipped out early, coat collar up, avoiding conversations he'd already outgrown. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards left not long after, restless, unsatisfied, carrying the strange feeling that they were winning a game whose rules they didn't fully understand. They ended up in a narrow bar off West 52nd Street, the kind of place that didn't care who you were as long as you paid and didn't talk too loud. A place where cigarettes burned low and nobody asked for autographs because nobody was supposed to be there. Dylan sat first, quiet, observant, eyes half-lidded like he was listening to something beneath the room. Mick was animated, sharp, performing even without a stage, asking questions about America, about lyrics, about how Dylan managed to sound like he wasn't trying at all when everyone else was clearly trying too hard. Keith leaned back, amused, watching the exchange like a card game where he knew someone was about to lose. The talks circled music, fame, pressure, the sudden realization that millions of people were listening whether you wanted them to or not. At one point, Keith laughed and said, half joking, half serious, "We just want to know how you make it feel like it matters." And Dylan didn't answer right away. He looked at his drink, then at Mick, and then he said the thing that changed everything. "You're still singing like you're asking permission." Dylan said quietly, not unkind, but not soft either. The table went still. Mick's smile froze, just for a second, the way it does when someone hits a nerve you didn't know was exposed. Dylan didn't stop. "You sound great," he continued, "but you don't sound inevitable. You sound like a band trying to prove something. Rock doesn't prove. Rock arrives." Mick bristled, instinctively, because confidence was his armor, and armor doesn't like being tested. Keith smirked, because Keith understood immediately that Dylan wasn't attacking them, he was diagnosing them. Mick pushed back. "People seem to like what we're doing," he said, carefully. Dylan nodded. "People like lots of things that don't last," he replied. That's when the room changed. This wasn't small talk anymore. This was a line being drawn between entertainment and truth, between style and substance, between bands that burned bright and bands that burned deep. Dylan leaned back and delivered the part Mick would later admit haunted him the most. "You're dangerous on stage," Dylan said, "but not in the songs. The danger disappears once the performance ends. If you want it to last, you have to stop trying to be clever and start being honest, even when it makes you uncomfortable." Mick felt it like a slap, because cleverness was his weapon, his shield, his way of staying in control. Honesty was messy. Honesty didn't guarantee applause. The bar noise faded around them as Dylan kept talking, explaining that clever lyrics age fast but truth ages slow, that rock music wasn't about impressing people, but about confronting them, that the best songs don't invite agreement, they demand attention. "Write something people can't shake," Dylan said. "Something that doesn't let them off easy." There was no dramatic ending, no handshake sealing a pact. Dylan stood up first, paid his share, pulled his coat tight, and left without looking back, disappearing into the cold the way he always did, leaving behind a silence heavier than the smoke in the room. Keith laughed it off, ordering another drink, joking that Dylan had always liked the sound of his own voice. Mick laughed too, but it didn't reach his eyes, because something Dylan said had lodged itself deep, something Mick didn't want to hear but couldn't forget. That the Stones, for all their swagger, were still circling the truth instead of stepping into it. That they were playing rebellion like a role instead of living it like a consequence. That night didn't feel historic. It felt irritating, unfinished, unresolved. And those are the moments that change everything, whether you want them to or not. Mick Jagger told himself he forgot about that night. But forgetting and bearing are not the same thing. And weeks later, the words Bob Dylan dropped in that narrow New York bar were still echoing every time Mick picked up a pen, every time he stepped into a studio, every time he watched an audience scream back lyrics that suddenly felt thinner than they had before. January 1966, London, Olympic Studios, the Rolling Stones surrounded by amplifiers, ashtrays, half-empty glasses, and the growing pressure of being the band everyone expected to lead the revolution without ever asking what direction it should go. They were successful beyond reason, chart toppers, scandal magnets, symbols, but Mick felt a creeping unease he couldn't shake, the uncomfortable realization that fame had arrived faster than certainty. He found himself rewriting lyrics late at night, crossing out lines that sounded smart but hollow, lines that danced around ideas instead of grabbing them by the throat. Keith noticed first. "You're cutting all the fun bits," he said one afternoon, watching Mick rip a page from his notebook. Mick didn't answer. He didn't know how to explain that the fun bits suddenly felt like camouflage. Dylan's voice sat in his head, uninvited but persistent. "You're still asking permission." Mick hated how accurate it felt. He started listening differently, not just to Dylan but to everything around him. The way women spoke in interviews, the tension in news broadcasts about Vietnam, the quiet resentment behind suburban smiles, the pills and promises sold to keep people functioning. The Stones had always flirted with danger, but now Mick realized flirting wasn't the same as commitment. One night, alone in his flat, he started writing without thinking about melody, without worrying if it sounded like a Stones song, without imagining how it would look on stage. The words came darker, sharper, accusatory, less interested in charm. "Mother needs something today to calm her down." He stopped, stared at the page. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't clever. It was blunt. He kept going anyway. When he brought the lyrics into rehearsal, the room reacted immediately. Charlie frowned. Bill shifted uncomfortably. Keith raised an eyebrow. "That's bleak," Keith said. Mick nodded. "That's the point." They played it anyway, and something changed in the air, a tension that wasn't performance-based but emotional, like the song wasn't entertaining them so much as confronting them. Mick felt it then, the difference Dylan had been pointing toward. This wasn't about rebellion as image. This was about observation, about holding up something ugly and refusing to soften it. The more Mick leaned into that discomfort, the more the song shifted. He stopped writing about being dangerous and started writing about consequences, about control, about hypocrisy, about desire stripped of romance. At times he worried they'd gone too far, that audiences wanted villains they could admire, not mirrors they couldn't escape. But Dylan's other lines surfaced again. "Clever dates fast. Truth ages slow." By March, the Stones were no longer chasing approval, and that scared the people paid to manage their success. Andrew Lloyd Oldham tried to steer things back toward hits, reminding Mick that controversy sells only until it doesn't. Mick listened politely and ignored him. Something had clicked, and once that happens, you can't unhear it. The band took the new songs on the road, and the reaction was immediate and unsettling. Audiences still screamed, but there was confusion too, moments where the noise dropped and people actually listened. Critics noticed the shift before the band did. "The Stones no longer sound like they're playing at Rebellion," one review read. "They sound like they believe it." Mick kept his head down, but privately he knew where the pivot began. Not in a studio, not in a contract dispute, not in a chart position, but in a bar where Bob Dylan had taken one look at him and refused to flatter him. By the time they recorded Paint It Black, Mick understood the full weight of Dylan's advice. The song didn't invite you in. It closed the door and dared you to knock. It wasn't interested in empathy. It was interested in truth. When it climbed the charts, something subtle but irreversible happened in rock music. Bands noticed. Labels noticed. Suddenly, it wasn't enough to look dangerous. You had to sound like you meant it. Years later, Mick would admit that period was the first time he stopped thinking of himself as a performer and started thinking of himself as a writer, a communicator, someone responsible for what the song said once it left his mouth. He never called Dylan for advice again. He didn't need to. The damage was done, in the best way possible. Dylan had planted the idea that rock music didn't exist to charm or reassure. It existed to confront, to provoke, to linger. And Mick Jagger, whether he liked it or not, had listened. Mick Jagger didn't talk about Bob Dylan's advice for years. Not because he forgot it, but because by the time he understood what it had done to him, the change was already permanent, and admitting it felt like giving away the secret behind the curtain. By the late 1960s, rock music had hardened, sharpened, learned how to stare back at the world instead of winking at it. And the Rolling Stones were no longer chasing relevance, they were defining it, whether they were ready for that responsibility or not. Songs like Sympathy for the Devil didn't ask for approval, didn't explain themselves, didn't care if you were comfortable, and that wasn't accidental. That was the result of a shift in mindset, a quiet internal recalibration that began the night Bob Dylan refused to tell Mick Jagger what he wanted to hear. As the years passed and interviews piled up, Mick became more careful with his words, more aware of how mythology calcifies around moments until the truth disappears inside the legend. When asked about Dylan, he'd smile, deflect, say something polite about influence, about respect between artists, about shared eras. But occasionally, when the room was quiet and the question was asked the right way, he let something real slip through. He'd talk about the mid-60s as a time when everyone was pretending to know where rock was going, when in reality nobody did. He'd admit that success came before understanding, that the Stones had power before they had clarity. And then he'd say it, almost casually, as if it were obvious in hindsight. Bob once told us to stop trying to be impressive and start being unavoidable. No flourish, no dramatics, just the truth. Jagger would explain that Dylan wasn't talking about volume or outrage or spectacle. He was talking about intent, about whether a song existed to perform rebellion or to embody it. That distinction, Mick would say, changed how he wrote, how he sang, how he stood on stage. Suddenly the performance wasn't the point. The message was. And once that switch flipped, there was no going back to clever poses or safe provocations. The Stones weren't the only ones watching. Other bands took notes, consciously or not. The Beatles pushed further inward. American rock grew teeth. Lyrics stopped apologizing. Albums stopped pretending to be collections of singles and started acting like statements. The idea that an artist should make people comfortable began to feel outdated, even dishonest. Dylan didn't lead that charge alone, but he articulated something others were feeling and forced Mick Jagger, one of the most visible figures in rock, to confront it head-on. That's why the advice mattered. Not because it was poetic or profound, but because it arrived at exactly the moment it could do the most damage. Jagger would later admit that Dylan's comment scared him, not because it was insulting, but because it stripped away the safety net. If you stop asking permission, you also lose the excuse of ignorance. Every word becomes a choice. Every song becomes a responsibility. That pressure reshaped rock music in ways people didn't recognize until years later. By the time punk arrived, by the time artists openly challenged power, sexuality, politics, and identity, the ground had already been prepared. Rock no longer needed approval from radio, television, or polite society. It had learned how to survive without it. That lineage traces back to countless moments, but one of them happened quietly, without witnesses, without headlines, without anyone knowing they were watching history bend. Dylan never took credit. He rarely does. In his version of events, he probably just had a drink, said what he thought, and left. That's how these things usually happen. The people who change culture rarely announce it. They just say the thing everyone else is avoiding and let the consequences unfold. Mick Jagger, decades later, standing on stages in front of tens of thousands of people, singing songs that refuse to soften their edges, understands that now. Rock didn't change because someone planned it. It changed because someone stopped pretending. And once that happened, the music couldn't go back to asking for permission. It had learned how to arrive.